Thank you all for attending today's online crime fiction seminar. My name is Stewart King and I will be your host today. Now, before introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Abhimanyu Acharya, I want to begin by acknowledging that to research, write about and teach crime fiction in Australia is to recognise that the foundational fiction of this country is terra nullius, that is the belief that there was nobody here before the arrival of the English. And its foundational crime is the dispossession of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. For these reasons, I acknowledge the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong peoples of the Kulin nations on whose unceded lands we are meeting virtually today. I also want to express my sadness at the recent death of our colleague, Jared Hayes. Jared was the Professor of French and Francophone Studies at Monash, and he was a co-chief investigator on the ARC grant World Crime Fiction, Making Sense of a Global Genre, which was the impetus, or is the impetus for this series of crime fiction seminars. Jared had a strong interest in Francophone crime fiction, particularly relating to gender and sexuality, and as practiced in the Francophone Caribbean and Americas. He will be sorely missed. I know Jared would have been fascinated by the topic of today's seminar by Dr. Abhimanyu Acharya on Sherlock Holmes in Gujarati, the politics of adaptation under colonial rule. Dr. Acharya is an academic, an award-winning short story writer, playwright, and theatre director. He completed his PhD at the University of Western Ontario in Canada, where he is currently a postdoctoral associate. He has received numerous awards for his critical and directorial work in Gujarati, Hindi, and in English, which is impressive indeed. So please, everyone, make Abhimanyu welcome, and we'll pass the, we'll get him to share his screen and to begin his talk, which will go for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have question time afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stewart, and thank you all for joining today. Again, I would like to acknowledge the passing, very unfortunate passing of Professor Gerard Hayes, and yeah, he's in my thoughts, and so are all the colleagues at Monash. Thank you, Stewart, for inviting me here as part of World Crime Fiction Seminar. My talk is on Sherlock Holmes and how his stories were adapted into Gujarati, received into Gujarati, and how it really created really a genre of detective fiction in a very regional vernacular Indian language. I'm very excited, and I would like to acknowledge the World Crime Fiction research, the project that is going on at Monash, and I'm very much looking forward to the results and the way it would inevitably contribute to our collective understanding of the genre of crime fiction. So yeah, so let's come to our today's topic, and I will share my screen here for a second. Yeah, I hope everybody can see it. You all can, right? Okay. All right. So, so most of the scholarly work in Anglophone academia in India has focused, when it comes to crime fiction, it has almost exclusively focused on Bengali, which is great. It has some amazing crime writers and some exceptional scholars. What is unfortunate is that it has kind of happened at the expense of other vernacular crime fiction traditions, so that the image now in the West, every time I talk to anybody who is not from India, who's not from South Asia, the image that they have of crime fiction from South Asia is Bengali, or from India at least is Bengali crime fiction. And my talk today, I would like to expand really the canvas of Indian crime fiction as such, and make a case for or Gujarati, which is my mother tongue. It is also the land where I come from. And yeah, so such a phenomenon is it has several regional, historical, political, and cultural reasons that we will not delve into. Why certain languages are privileged over the others. It's a long history, but we'll focus on Gujarati crime fiction for today. Uh, for those not familiar with uh, geez, I'm trying to move my move to my next slide. Uh, then let me, maybe now. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this is just uh, for those unfamiliar with the geography of India and of Gujarat. The blue shaded parts, so there's a map of India, and the blue part is where Gujarat is situated. More than 5 crore people reside there, and a lot more in the diaspora. And their language is Gujarati, so all the literature written is received by these many people. Uh, and yeah, the talk is structured in two parts. The first part is a contextual overview. I will provide a bird's eye view of the origins and development of crime fiction within the socio-political context of colonial and post-colonial Gujarat. Not post-colonial so much, but mostly colonial Gujarat, while shedding light on how adaptations, translations, recreations, and free emulations of Sherlock Holmes stories were all part of the creation of the genre of detective fiction in Gujarati. In the process, I will also rehearse key practitioners of crime fiction, as well as several Gujarati translators who, over the past century, have brought Sherlock Holmes stories to different generations of Gujarat. Uh, and the second part is a more slightly more academic in nature, in the sense that it will closely read and compare Arthur Conan Doyle's celebrated Sherlock Holmes story, The Adventure of the Speckled Band, with its Gujarati adaptation, which is also the first time that uh, Sherlock Holmes story was adapted into Gujarati. So it was the first ever adaptation, the first ever iteration of detective fiction, and it was The Adventure of the Speckled Band. And it was adapted by the acclaimed writer Ramanbhai Neelkanth in 1899, just 7 years after I think 7 or 8 years after the original story was published in English. And through close reading of the original story and its Gujarati adaptation, I will argue how the text resists colonial authority while also getting enmeshed in a in asserting a certain upper caste Brahminical superiority. So that's my larger point. Uh, I shall begin now. So Gujarati detective fiction, like detective fiction in other Indian languages, was a product of a variety of forces. Originating at the turn of the 20th century, detective fiction in South Asia was, according to Francesca Orsini and Laura Brueck, a product of three interconnected phenomena, which were this, and it's a quote, the local boom in print media, which involved new technologies of production and distribution, old and new genres, as well as new figures of writer entrepreneurs actively searching for new and extended readership bases, colonial law and policing, and its backlash within Indian society, particularly with regards to what was perceived as intrusion in matters relating to property, inheritance, marriage, and sexuality, and the influx of European, specifically English and French detective fiction, Vidocq and Sue, as well as Conan Doyle, of course. So, end quote. The heated debates between the Orientalists and the Anglicists in the early decades of the 19th century culminated in the infamous Minutes by John Macaulay in 1835, where he played a substantial role in deciding the education policy in colonial India. Macaulay's Minutes, infamous Minutes on Indian Education, advocated for an educated class of Indians well versed in English language and manners who could serve as intermediaries between the British and their Indian subjects. The foundation of educational institutes in various parts of India, such as Elphinstone College, Bombay University, and Calcutta University, where the medium of education and instruction was English, gave rise to a class of Indians who were inculcated with a belief in colonial reforms by their educational experience. Colonial reforms were nothing but a roundabout way of providing a moral justification to the colonial rule, since these reforms were, according to the colonial rhetoric, ways of saving India from itself. Colonial reforms entailed putting a ban on native religious customs, mostly Hindu customs, such as widow immolation, eradicating of widow remarriage, critiquing the Hindu caste structure, modernizing the Indian landscape through building new infrastructure, and so on. So colonial reforms had far-reaching implications, for it fundamentally transformed the legal, socio-political, and religious spheres, since reforms were carried out in all these spheres. Trained in Western-style education, some native young graduates became the first Indian reformers who believed in the spirit of Western rationality and were well versed in the latest texts in British history and culture. Simultaneously, the educational institutes also gave rise to scholars who were exposed to ancient Sanskrit texts, because part of the civilizing mission was to also educate Indians in their own glorious ways of living. The colonial notion that India fell from grace from its past glory and became uncivilized due to the belief in irrational and superstitious customs, ironically paved the way for the cultural revivalist agenda, which advocated for a return to ancient Hindu ways of living and thinking. The cultural revivalists relied on Orientalist scholarship by scholars such as Sir William Jones, Henry T. Colebrook, and Alexander Forbes, amongst others. Cultural revivalists were well versed in Sanskrit, and they advocated reforms rooted in native customs and spiritual practices. They were not strict believers in reforms based on rationality and were often at odds with colonial reformers. The cultural revivalist agenda and the reformist agenda were, in sum, two different ways to approach the idea of reform, and thus enabled an entire discourse in the 19th and early 20th centuries on the correct way to reform a nation. Now, this is the larger context. Let's look at the origins of detective fiction in Gujarati and the way writers deployed it for reformist purposes. The rise of the print medium led to the emergence of popular newspapers and journals, as well as several literary genres in various Indian languages. The first Gujarati novel, called Karan Gelo, was written in 1868 by Naval Ram Pandya. The first Gujarati essay, called Bhoot Niban, which is an essay on ghosts, was written by Dalpat Ram in 1851, whereas the first Gujarati autobiography, which was recently translated into English this year, called Mari Hakikat, was written by Narmad in 1866. So now, with an entire generation of natives trained in English education, it was only a matter of time before the effects of English and European literature would show in the regional literatures of India. Along with the adaptation of Shakespearean plays, several contemporaneous British texts were read, translated, and circulated. Once Sherlock Holmes gained popularity in Britain, it also had its echoes in India, and several local avatars of Holmes and Watson were soon cooked up in different Indian languages, thus inaugurating detective fiction. In Gujarati, the first detective story, titled Chatushkon, which is square, was written by Ramanbhai Neelkanth and was published in 1899 in a reformist journal called Gnansudha. In the story, he introduces Vasant Rai, a local Brahmin who was with the colonial police force earlier. Vasant Rai is nothing but the Gujarati version of Sherlock Holmes. After a few months, Neelkanth adapted Arthur Conan Doyle's The Speckled Band, which is our topic today, one of the celebrated stories featuring Sherlock Holmes into Gujarati. Except for the change in the language and the setting, the entire story remains the same. Both these stories introduced a model of the detective story, where the crime is domestic, where the mystery is solved with rationality and cold logic, and where the detective embodies the values popularized by the European Enlightenment. The overlapping network of South Asian detective fiction was formed by translations and adaptations, not only from European languages, but also within South Asian languages. So apart from English, Bengali and Hindi languages have acted as stable source languages from which Gujarati writers have faithfully and often not so faithfully continued translating detective fiction. Several novels in Gujarati, such as Chandrika by Hiralal Vardhaman Shah and Bedak Khun by Shankarlal Shukla, published in 1910 and 1924, respectively, were translated from Hindi or Bengali, and the name of the original writers were never mentioned. In a few years, detective fiction became a flourishing genre in Gujarati, with several different publishers jumping in to reap the benefits of its popularity. So, in Chandrika, a Gujarati translation of a Hindi novel, the writer Hiralal Shah states in the preface how within a decade, detective novels became popular in Gujarati, majorly due to their publication in various newspapers and journals published in Mumbai, or Bombay as it was called then. Detective fiction in colonial South Asia, especially in the early years, also became a vehicle for the articulation of the reformist ideology. So rationality was considered the supreme value that directed the reformist movement, and detective fiction of the times certainly aided in disseminating these ideas. Uh, how was it appropriate? If you look at the slide, Ram Shankarlal is one Gujarati novelist. In the preface to his Gujarati detective novel called Snenu Katil Swarup, Yane Khoon, which translates to the dangerous avatar of love or murder, he mentions, and I quote, in this work, the key concern is to show the adventures of the secret police. The main character, Mr. Bihari Lal, is a detective. His indomitable work ethic, bravery, intelligence, hard work, cleverness, and unflinching attitude, even in the face of death, are all qualities that can be very helpful to know for the contemporary secret police. Moreover, some of his other qualities are such that even regular common people, in addition to the secret police, should follow them. I do not doubt that this book will be beneficial even to common civilians. End quote. Snenu Katil Swarup Khun, this particular novel, written during the high colonial period in the early 20th century, clarifies the underlying reformist intentions of many of the Gujarati detective authors and shows how detective fiction was seen as a reformist genre that could help instill values of ethics, bravery, intelligence, hard work, and cleverness in both police and common civilians. In Gujarati, translations from British and French detective literature, as well as original stories and novels in Indian languages, often modeled after British or French detective works, became popular. So Krishna Lal Javeri, a reputed Gujarati critic, makes a note of this growing trend in a lecture delivered in 1934. What does he say? Javeri states, and I quote, when Mrs. Henry Wood or Miss Mary Corelli went out of fashion in England, the type of novel they specialized in lost favor here. When the detective stories of Sherlock Holmes and Le Gaverau came into vogue, the exploits of their heroes again found an echo here. While it is not quite correct to say that the Gujarati novel is the counterpart of the English novel, so far as the vogue of fiction writing is concerned, there is no doubt that the one follows the other. End quote. While being mostly accurate in his assessment that Gujarati detective stories often followed in the footsteps of British and sometimes French traditions of crime fiction, often based on Sherlock Holmes or the Roman policier El Gaberau, it's still complicated, as we will see that when they are adapted, they are doing something else, something very rooted, something that benefits them and their socio-political agendas. So Tarun K. Saint, in his edited volumes on Indian detective fiction, it just came out recently, from Hatchett, he mentions, and I quote, that local detective figures did not take long to appear as aspiring authors across the subcontinent sought to emulate Western models and templates. Also, in the wake of the widespread circulation of pulp fiction, for instance, at A.H. Wheeler stores, at railway stations, and the extensive readership that emerged following the publication of the latest story or novel in magazine form or as standalone editions. End quote. So in the adaptations, we can see local writers infusing their own reformist or cultural revivalist agendas, right? In 1931, another writer called Chandulal Vyas, a writer based out of Ranpur in Western India and Gujarat, founded a magazine called Bahurupi, which translates to Master of Disguise, a Gujarati magazine solely dedicated to the publication of detective fiction. He was a celebrated writer whose highly popular character, Chitragupt, was another Gujarati recreation of Sherlock Holmes. Chandulal Vyas wrote more than 10 novels in the Chitragupt series. His assistant was called Manhar. However, Vyas, despite borrowing greatly from the Holmesian stories, moves significantly away insofar as the aesthetic choices are concerned. First of all, while most of the original Holmes stories are written in the first person and narrated by Watson, Vyas's stories are in the third person. Secondly, Manhar, despite being a Watson-like figure, is not always central to the mystery. Sometimes he's unaware of it, and sometimes he's not even featured in the stories. Chitragupt shares many traits with Holmes, including his sharp observation and deduction skills, as well as his facility with wrestling and hand-to-hand combat. So there are certain overlaps, but there are also certain departures. And another thing to note down is that one of the implications and consequences really of the reformist movement was a prevalent sexual morality, which also spilled onto other genres, spilled onto the theater and all of that. And the larger idea was the reformist movement was very concerned in the creation of good woman, who was modeled after the Victorian uh, Victorian good woman, really, domestic angel. So the sexual morality prevalent in Gujarat provided a conducive environment for the flourishing of Sherlock Holmes stories, since the stories famously avoided violence and sexual descriptions. Elsewhere, I have argued in a different paper that how the reformist impulse of detective fiction turns into a nationalist impulse after Indian independence. But for now, let's leave it and look at the translations and adaptations of Holmes in Gujarati over the years. So we saw that Ramanbhai Neelkanth adapted the Speckled Band into Gujarati, creating Vasantlal and Ratilal in the form of Holmes and Watson. Later on, a famous mystery writer called Dhansukh Mehta translated some of the Holmesian stories in an anthology titled Detective Bahadur Sherlock Holmes, which means Brave Detective Sherlock Holmes, published in 1909. Under the title Chamatkarik Khoon, which is magical murder, Chandulal Vyas had translated Holmesian novel The Sign of Four into Gujarati in 1928. In 1987, Sukanya Jhaveri translated 5 stories under the title Sherlock Holmes Ni Rahasya Katha, which is mystery stories of Sherlock Holmes. And the most popular translation of Holmes' stories into Gujarati is by Ramanlal Soni in 1998. In 5 parts, Soni translated 48 Sherlock Holmes stories into Gujarati. So these are some of the translators and what they translated. And more recently, Mansi Kakadia Soda translated A Study in Scarlet, The Sign of Four, The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, The Return of Sherlock Holmes, and The Hound of Baskervilles in Gujarati. And this is as recent as 2021. And last year in 2024, which is the latest translation of Sherlock Holmes into Gujarati, is by Jyoti Kumar Vaishnav, who translated several stories as well as The Sign of Four. So I think it was important to name all the translators, for often they are overlooked in scholarship and their role is often underplayed in dissemination or creation of a specific genre, in this case, the genre of detective fiction. So this was the first half of my talk. Now we move on to the more focused close reading of the Speckled Band and its adaptation. Before we do that, this is some book covers, the recent translations of Holmesian stories into Gujarati. And you can see the classic uh, visual, the hat, the pipe, all of that. This photo is not as great, but this was the only one I could find. And this is Sir Ramanbhai Neelkanth, who was born in 1968 and he passed in 1928. And he was the first person. He's more famous for his other literary endeavors, but this part, his contribution to Gujarati detective fiction is is absent really. It's not even overlooked. It's not there at all. Uh, for those unfamiliar with the plot, I'm sure it's a crime fiction seminar. Everybody has come with interest. So most people are familiar, but in case you are not, I'll quickly rehearse the plot summary of The Speckled Band. A young woman named Helen Stoner visits Holmes, fearing for her life. Her twin sister Julia died mysteriously 2 years earlier, just before her wedding, after uttering the cryptic words, "The Speckled Band." Helen now hears strange noises in the night and has been moved into Julia's old room by her stepfather, Dr. Grimsby Roylott, a violent and aggressive man with a background in India. Holmes and Watson investigate the Roylott estate, Stoke Moran. They discover odd details in Helen's room: a ventilator that connects to Dr. Roylott's room, a bell pull that doesn't work, and a bed bolted to the floor. Holmes deduces that these features are part of a deadly plan. That night, Holmes and Watson stake out the room. When they see a snake, which is the speckled band, coming through the ventilator, Holmes strikes it with a cane, sending it back into Roylott's room. The snake fatally bites Roylott instead. Holmes reveals that Roylott had trained the venomous swamp adder to kill Julia and planned to do the same to Helen to prevent them from marrying and claiming their inheritance. So this is a larger plot summary. Now, scholars have already provided a cogent critique of the speckled band and the way it aids the project of the colonial empire. For instance, scholars such as S.C. Harris, Zainab Ali, and L.J. Fluett have critiqued the depictions of Indians and India in the speckled band, paying particular attention to the racist undertones in the language used to describe them, including the attempt to equate Indians with animals, as well as the choice of the murder weapon. So Watson states in the beginning of the story that Holmes was in the detective business not for money or fame. He only took on cases that he found unusual. Zainab Ali contends that in the Speckled Band, the unusual connotes people who were touched by India in some form. According to Fluett, and this is a quote, Doyle's audience is invited to take for granted an understood perceptible difference between its own Englishness and the criminal, orientalized Englishness Grimsby Roylott, who is the central villain in the story, manifests. End quote. Doyle incites fear of the other through animals. In The Adventure of the Speckled Band, Helen explains that Roylott, a British doctor who is marked by time spent in India, kept a cheetah and a baboon, which made Helen and her sister wary. She states, and this is her statement, "We had no feeling of security unless our doors were locked." This could be read as the Western response to immigration, and with the current world scenarios, it has so many implications, so much is unpacked in this one particular sentence. Furthermore, Watson states that he had forgotten that the doctor had strange pets and commented that they might find a cheetah on their shoulder any minute. In his characterization of Roylott's pets, not only is Watson cautioning readers at the infiltration of strangers in their space, but he's also warning them that the threat is hidden and can strike at any moment. Finally, the murder weapon in Doyle's Speckled Band is revealed to be a deadliest snake in India. Harris notes that even though the idea of the venomous snake was based on a rare Indian poison, the deadly poison depicted by Conan Doyle did not actually exist. Doyle fabricates a poison to incite fear in the reader's mind while emphasizing its Indian origins. In addition, Zainab Ali notes how Holmes explains that the idea of the snake being used as a murder weapon occurred to him immediately when he heard that the doctor had creatures from India, and that the poison that was used to kill Helen's sister could only be devised by a clever and ruthless man who had an Eastern trading. So these are literal quotes from the story. India's influence on Roylott is the only evidence Holmes needs to deduce that he is guilty. Placing Roylott as a criminal and connecting his criminal behavior to his time in India allows for Doyle to portray the idea that, and according to Stewart, I quote, the detection and policing of criminal identity in England was deeply implicated with the suppression of the foreign nationalities commanded throughout the empire, and that by policing Roylott, Doyle was able to police the unseen, the imagined colonial subject in India, and the unassimilated domestic other. End quote. To sum it up in a sentence, The Speckled Band is a racist story. Now comes the interesting part. Ramanbhai Neelkanth, acclaimed Gujarati writer, we just saw the photo and all, and more famous for his novel Badram Badra, chooses this particular story to adapt to a Gujarati setting. It is through the adaptation of this story that the genre of detective fiction is kind of inaugurated, really. So, what are the core elements adapted? For one, Holmes and Watson become Vasant Rai and Ratilal, both liberal-minded reformers and upper caste Brahmins. Elites, really, cultural elites. Vasant Rai is shown to be a retired officer from the Colonial Metropolitan Police operating in India. He retires to a small, unnamed village. The space is a major shift in the adaptation, as Conan Doyle's works are situated in London, whereas Neelkanth chooses rural India. It is my belief that Neelkanth wanted to set the story in a setting devoid of British influence. In 19th century India, colonial powers had its headquarters in urban cities such as Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. However, the rural areas were still under princely states. The British often used kings and princes as puppets to implement new laws, but it was hard for them to have direct access to rural India. So again, this is the map of British India, and you can see that all the pink parts are British India and all the yellow parts are under princely states. And it was almost through a collaboration that the rule was kind of going on. And this is an more recent one. Earlier, the map looked slightly different. Uh, Now, choosing a setting without any direct colonial influence provided Neelkanth the scope to color the story with local concerns. As well, it provides a space to challenge the imperialist ideas of race and rationality. In Conan Doyle's story, the white man is considered the most rational by Sherlock Holmes, whereas India is seen as a volatile land of animals and evilness that corrupt white men. However, in Neelkanth's work, Vasant Rai, the Gujarati avatar of Holmes, reverses the rational superiority. His reason to leave the police force is because he gets bored and finds himself superior to the colonial police operating in urban Indian centers. Moreover, in an accompanied story, which in itself is not an adaptation of Holmesian story, but is written in a style similar with Vasant Rai and Ratilal as key characters, the story shows that Vasant Rai also believed in learning Sanskrit and using ancient Hindu knowledge to solve crimes, as opposed to relying solely on Western rationality, the cornerstone of 19th century reform movement. Reform was the biggest concern during Ramanbhai's times, at least for him. However, scholars such as Neera Desai have shown how the 19th century reform movement in India was an elite upper caste movement. Most of the conservative issues, such as widow immolation, ban on widow remarriage, the lack of property rights, were issues of upper caste Hindu women. On the other hand, Dalit and oppressed caste women had more agency, and the conservative issues plaguing the upper caste Hindu society did not apply to them, as they were often discriminated by and ostracized by the upper caste cultural elites. In Neelkanth's adaptation, one can read caste anxieties of the elites. So one of the key aspects of caste discrimination is untouchability, which itself is tied intrinsically to the notion of caste purity. In the adaptation, Helen, who is now Kesar, who was a Brahmin woman, in the original story, Helen's mother remarries Roylott when her husband passes. In the Gujarati version, widow remarriage is still a contested issue and not widely accepted. As a result, in the Gujarati version, the mother dies early on and the father falls sick, and he leaves the two daughters as a responsibility to his unmarried younger brother. Therefore, in Neelkanth's story, the battle of property is not between stepfather and stepchildren, but between an uncle and his nieces. Udairam, who is the villain in Gujarati, the uncle, is seen as someone who has forgotten his caste roots. In other words, his evilness is equated with the caste company he keeps. It is useful to compare passages from the original and the adaptation to understand how racial politics is shifted to caste politics. So, this is a quote from the original. He had no friends at all, save the wandering gypsies, and he would give these vagabonds and would accept in return the hospitality of their tents, wandering away with them sometimes for weeks on end. This is from the original story. The gypsies, the term, originally a racially coded word for the indigenous and wandering communities in South Asia, implicitly conveys the discriminatory notions against Indians. In Ramanbhai's story, the gypsies are replaced by communities such as Bawas and street magicians, who were low caste people. The inclusion of magicians is conspicuous, and I propose that the presence of magicians in the story hints at the larger ideological battle between rational reform and irrational magic. Given that the magicians, representatives of irrationality, superstition, or supernatural, essentially an other to the rational world, they are seen in a bad light who ends up corrupting Udairam, which makes the story's rational and reformist stand very clear. The Bawa caste, which is a nomadic caste, was also criminalized along with so many nomadic castes under British rule. And the Brahminical caste discrimination against Bawa caste further deteriorated their status in both colonized and independent India. Ramanbhai's adaptation then seems to suggest that Udairam, the evil uncle, who was a Brahmin, deteriorated from his caste status by being friends with people lower than his status. The way Conan Doyle blames a white man's evilness to his connections to India, Ramanbhai blames a Brahmin man's evilness to his connection to oppressed caste communities. Given that in India, oppressed caste communities are forced by oppressor castes to deal with animals, including skinning them, getting rid of their dead bodies, and even eating them, the connection of Udairam and his liking for animals has clear casteist connotations. In the original, when Helen mentions that she had no feeling of security unless the doors were locked, it had racist overtones. In Gujarati, Kesar mentions that she had to keep the door locked because she was afraid of animals. That could be read as the upper caste anxiety of being corrupted and becoming impure and losing one's caste status by getting associated with animals. So, to sum it up, the adaptation in its own way is a very casteist story. To conclude, one can say that uh, the Gujarati adaptation of the Speckled Band set in rural India instead of urban metropolitan and featuring a rational Indian man who rejects imperial police manages to subvert imperial authority. At the same time, the new context, it reveals its casteist undertones and caste anxieties of key characters, thus prefiguring how once India achieved political independence, it was mainly the cultural elites in India who replaced the socio-political authority of the British, and in a classic neo-colonial move, continued to discriminate and oppress the marginalized castes and nomadic tribes. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for that, Abhimanyu, for that fascinating presentation on the way in which the racist politics of the original, which is a short story that I teach to my students, takes on a caste issue as it becomes not just translated but adapted into the Gujarati. Absolutely fascinating. I open the panel up for questions. If anybody would like to ask a question by raising your hand or Bob.
Hi, Abhimanyu. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. It was really fascinating, as Stewart just said, the casteist element, which has kind of come into the new adaptation. But my question is relating to something else, which is you gave us a lovely list of people who are translating still into Gujarati. And there were some some references to the colonial period and some to more recent times. I'm just wondering, is the logic of translation in the newer and more recent works somehow different from colonial translations? Do they are they kind of different in any particular or real way? That would be my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Vaibhav. That's a great question. And the translations, as far as I know, are certainly inflected by the contemporaneous socio-political concerns. So the translations in colonial times, one of the fascinating things, and I'm working on that part, is that you often see a mixture of like two stories into one story when it is like translated into Gujarati. Uh, a famous case is when Sherlock Holmes is first introduced, I think in the Sign of Four, and then his method of deduction and all that is taken into a very different story into Gujarati, and the idea is to emphasize the rationality and how it aids the reform movement. But that was during colonial period. After independence, increasingly the concern is more nationalist. Increasingly, uh, the emphasis is on how Sherlock Holmes's ability helps Britain, and especially one of his later stories, right, where he aids in the war, and that is also a particularly popular story to translate in post-independence India, because then the concern is more nationalists. So I think there is clearly uh, clearly there is a difference in the logic of translation, and also in the language, the register of Gujarati that is being used, because earlier it was still kind of in flux. The standard language that we call Gujarati was still in flux, and it only got solidified and consolidated in early 20th century. So all the translations before, I think, 1930, they sound very different. The Gujarati sounds very different than what happens now. So yeah, but thanks for your question, and yeah.
Just to follow up on that, I think there's the Sherlock Holmes stories read very differently to how people speak today, of course, as well. So there is something about the age of the text as well. But anyway, Anita.
Yes, thank you very much for such a rich talk. It was really interesting. I had one quick comment and then a question. The comment on how when you were talking about how sort of adapting it to the reformist movement and emphasizing the moral value, the ethics. It reminded me very much of early, for example, detective fiction in Germany, where they would take actual crime cases like Schiller, and then put a preface saying that this is for the moral edification, and therefore blessing it as being not, low literature or lowbrow, but rather having moral value, which fit very much into the Victorian ideals of the time. So I thought that was a really interesting parallel there. Yeah, and then the question is, how were they received, the adaptations versus the translations? Because I've from today's sensibilities, yes, Arthur Conan Doyle is the racism is evident in the foreign versus the local. But there were so many translations, as you showed, from 1909, I think, to 2024. So it seems like there was an audience for it. How well was that received versus the adaptation? Did that speak more to local sensibilities?
So interestingly, the adaptations were pretty loose, except for Ramanbhai, who adapted this one particular story. There were other writers, but they never fully adapted any Holmesian stories, or at least not in my research. I'm sure that, like, if I dig more, there'll be more stuff to find out. But as far as I know, what they did was they took up tropes So certain characteristics of Holmes, as I mentioned with Chandulal Vyas, like the Holmes remains Holmes in Chitragupt, but Watson is very different, and the narrative style is very different, and the cases are very different. So there are certain overlaps in terms of characteristics or tropes, but the stories themselves are not adapted fully. So adaptations in the way we understand adaptations were not present, I guess. There were mostly translations because the name Sherlock Holmes had more currency for publication and selling than the adaptation. So I think even the publishers preferred that they do translations as opposed to adapt the stories. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Any other questions?
There is a question in the chat.
Sabrina, I think I have to unmute.
Oh.
I have to unmute Sabrina because she was, hang on. Let me, there we go.
I'm just wondering, yeah, can I ask a question? In general, I found it's very interesting talk. Can people hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, yeah, okay. I thought, something particular with your talk on the translation of the adventures of the speckled band. You mentioned, when the local translators translate that story, they deliberately change the conflict between the stepfather to stepdaughters, to the uncle and niece conflicts. I wonder if you would like to say something, elaborate a bit about that, because it sounds very interesting. So I've been wondering what actually motivates a translator to make that change.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for the question, Sabrina. And yeah, so that change is it's a very understandable change given the context of a 19th century Gujarat, which didn't exist actually. Gujarat formed in 1960, but the land that is still there. The issue was that step parenting entailed remarriage. And in the story, it's the mother, in the original story, it's the mother who remarries. So the stepfather becomes the villain in the original story. Now, in Gujarati, there was no way that Ramanbhai could show a mother remarrying because that was frowned upon. In fact, that was one of the most contested issues uh, during the reformist movement in 19th century. So it was not a common practice. People were fighting for it. People were fighting to have to get women the rights to remarry, right? So that was one of the things. So there was no way that he could show it as a normal thing. So he had to find another way to bring in the villain. And the easy route was to just, because in a joint family structure, which was very prevalent back then, even now at so many places in India. So uncle was an easy target. Father's younger brother living together is a very common phenomenon. And therefore it provided an easy, I guess, an easy way to navigate the challenge of how to show conflict. So I guess that's what Ramanbhai must have thought. That's why the change. I hope that answers Sabrina.
Thanks. It sounds very interesting. I mean, the local costume.
Yeah, local customs definitely colors the adaptations.
Aishwarya?
Hi, Abhimanyu. It was such a good presentation. So I had some doubts. So I usually read a little bit about, I'm from Kerala, and I read a little bit about Malayalam detective fiction. So my doubts are kind of connected to Malayalam detective fiction also. I was just curious. It's coming from a lot of from the place of curiosity. So are these adaptations acknowledged or unacknowledged? Like what happened in Malayalam, early Malayalam detective fiction is that even though there were a lot of adaptations of Sherlock Holmes, most of them were mostly unacknowledged, or they barely mentions that even though most some of them are pure translations, word to word translations, they rarely acknowledge it that these are translations. They would change the name and everything, but like I just wanted to know whether it's acknowledged or unacknowledged. And I have a couple of more questions that like I would like to add with it. One is that apart from Sherlock Holmes, is there any influence of other Western analytical detectives such as Agastya Dupin in Gujarati detective fiction, apart from Sherlock Holmes, like any other Western, detective influence of any other detectives?
Mhm.
And does this protagonists they stick to this analytical path of solving crime, or do they take in hard boiled turn, like does the stories also take like go into this hard boiled way of going like without much analytical part, it's
Yeah.
going more of them, and finally I would also like to know, like I know like I'm going a little bit overboard, but I would also like to know like whether this uh, Gujarati, early Gujarati detective fiction, were they also influenced by Bengali detective fictions or detective fictions from any other vernacular languages like Bengali or Hindi? Because the same thing happened with Malayalam. Like there were a lot of detective fictions which were adapted from Bengali or Hindi. Like I hope it was not too much. I would just like to know. I was curious. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Aishwarya, for all your questions. And I will take one after the other. So, about the acknowledgement part, Ramanbhai, when he adapted Speckled Band, he has acknowledged that it is an adaptation of Arthur Conan Doyle's Speckled Band. So he did it. But you are right, not many people did it. And there are as many unacknowledged adaptations as there are acknowledged ones. So yeah, I think the case is similar, given the newness of the print medium and how it was kind of slowly gaining popularity. A lot of people were just reaping in the benefits, and the idea of authorship was very different then. Uh, and Yeah, even with translations, a lot of even translations from Hindi, Bengali, or other languages, the original authors were not credited. You are simply told that it's from a Hindi novel, or this one is from a Bengali novel, or this one is from an English novel. But So I think the case is similar. But as far as this particular story is concerned that I took up today, it is acknowledged. Your second question about the influence of other detective figures from Western canon, I have recently come to know, and I am so fascinated by this discovery, that Miss Marple had echoes into Gujarati, and the first female detective in Gujarati was pretty much based on the model set up by Miss Marple. So I'm very eager to know more. I came to India for this archival research, and I found some fascinating books in Mumbai, and like in Farbus Gujarati Sabha, which has the archive of 19th and early 20th century Gujarati books. So yeah, I am very excited to just delve deep into this one. But in my research, I at least there is one model apart from Sherlock Holmes that was emulated. Uh, does the protagonist stick to analytical tradition or more hard boiled? I think it shifts. So the early detective fiction in Gujarati was pretty much in the tradition of Sherlock Holmes, but I think a lot of post-independence Gujarati scenario was influenced by hard-boiled American writers like Dashiell Hammett and James M. Cain and all those people. So post-independence is very interesting. A lot of things shift. The concerns shift, the aesthetic shift, the politics also shift. So I think hard-boiled becomes a more common phenomenon after independence. Uh, and uh, and yeah, as I also mentioned in my talk today, that there were numerous translations from Hindi and Bengali into Gujarati. These two languages were staple amongst Indian languages. These two languages were staple from which Gujarati writers heavily borrowed, translated, adapted, copied, and all that. So I hope I was able to satisfy some of your curiosities.
Thank you so
Shreya.
much, Abhimanyu. Thank you.
Just on that, we've got a couple of minutes for just a couple more questions. Before I invite Min, I was intrigued by your use of the term free emulations. You had free emulations, adaptations, recreations, and translations. What is this is getting very taxonomical, I suspect, but what's the difference between a free emulation and an adaptation as you see it?
I mean, I guess the difference would be the acknowledgement, which just Aishwarya asked, is that there were some stories circulating, which if you read them, you know that this is some Sherlock Holmes thing, but nobody mentions it. And then it is mixed with so many other concerns, like that it's also like at least 3 writers are being copied here in that one particular text. So I guess that would be an example of free emulations where the ideas of authorship, of copyright doesn't matter. Like it's just like people getting influenced and writing with their own. And the adaptation would be more formal, I guess, something that Ramanbhai does, where he is consciously adapting this particular story to local context, also acknowledging that it is the story, also kind of providing a paragraph really on why he wanted to do that and all that. So I think it's that. Yeah, transcreation would be something that Chandulal Vyas does in his Chitragupt stories, where he takes certain tropes, but then he really transforms the stories into very different things. So I guess all these terms, even though seemingly similar, still have their differences, I guess.
Thanks. Min, I think this might be our last question.
Yeah. Thank you for your fascinating talk. It's really interesting. Yeah, I'm sorry, I had to be away for 10 minutes. Maybe you already covered this. I just completely missed it. But my question is like in the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that there were in the books like discussion of sexuality and the figure of the good woman. So yeah, I was wondering like could you like just elaborate on this a bit more?
Yeah, of course. So that was one of the biggest reformist concerns was the creation of good woman on stage, in literature, later on in films, and the models were pretty much based on Victorian models of domestic angels, who are sacrificial, who will go through intense physical pain and suffering in order to prove that she is the good woman, she is the one. So that kind of model for good woman were very, very prevalent, and she would also be somebody who is not bold, who is not sexual, whose sexuality is not even acknowledged often. So that's the kind of idea that was very prevalent. And one of the consequences, I did not cover that part in my talk, but since you asked, I'll say it here, is that there was also this parallel line of sensational stories and gothic fiction and science fiction and detective, like a mixture of all these different genres. And some of them are also explicit in their descriptions of sexual acts or violence. And the reformist moralist mindset really marginalized these stories. Some of these stories, I'm only finding it now that these are present, but these are not acknowledged in any histories. Nobody knows of these writers. In fact, I am trying to find a lot more information on some of the writers I'm working on by finding their families, because you can't know when they were born, what they published, nothing. It's so, yeah, no research exists really. And part of the reason was this morality, sexual morality, the idea of good women. Hope that
Thank you.
helps.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
And
Thank you.
thank you. Yeah, and very quickly, I think there was a question in the chat. I'll address that, and then we can maybe, yeah, Suyasha Singh has a question. you're interested in Ramanbhai not only adapting the Holmesian stories, but also taking the career, writing original stories. Do we see more original concerns and anxieties? Yes, that is true. So Ramanbhai wrote another story called Chatushkon, translated as The Square. And in that, we see his cultural revivalist concerns. So the case is solved. So there is a superstitious criminal who does some ritual, like a death ritual, to sacrifice somebody else. And Vasant Rai, who is a local avatar of Holmes, solves it because he knows Sanskrit and he knows of that ritual. So the implicit idea is that if you know your tradition, it helps. If you know your like roots, it helps. And the best way to solve anything is with this mixture of Western rationality and Indian roots. I guess that's what the story is trying to implicitly advocate for. So, but yeah, there are, you do see original concerns and anxieties of the native population.
That's very interesting. Very, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Weber, for pointing that out. Harvey against this round. I checked out.
Okay, I'll since I missed that question, just I'll leave it up for one last question. Anyone? If not, please join me in thanking Abhimanyu for what was, as Anita described, a very rich and fascinating talk about this area of crime fiction, which we, particularly in the West, know so little about. And I'm very interested to learn more about the hybrid detective science fiction genre that was emerging very early in the Gujarati tradition. I think we might be able to change how we see the history of crime fiction from classic detective to hard-boiled through to eventually genre hybridity much later. It sounds very interesting. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stewart, and thank you, everyone.